Bring in Rachel Maddow, of course, Air America and MSNBC analyst. Your take, essentially, and Pat Buchanan there. Let me get you, Rachel, your take first on, it's really been an extraordinary morning.
It really has. I mean, I think that we need to talk about what's going on with Michigan. I think we also need to talk about how things were left with Florida. As far as I can tell right now, we've got an agreement between the Obama campaign and the Florida Democratic Party that they will all agree that the superdelegates will be seated in full and the pledged delegates will be seated in half. Essentially, that's their agreement. That is a big concession from the Obama campaign. That is not, however, a consensus. There's a third party involved that has not signaled that they would support that sort of deal in Florida. I am not hearing from the Clinton campaign so far that they would support that thing that has been agreed to for the Florida delegation. So as long as the Florida issue is unresolved, according to the Clinton campaign, they have given every signal that they will see that as a reason to keep pushing for this. Now, Nora, you're totally right to note that 10 days ago in that interview with the Associated Press, when Senator Clinton said that she was willing to take this to the convention, it was phrased specifically as she would support Florida and Michigan Democrats all the way to the convention. But what happens if Florida isn't pushing the case anymore and it's really only Senator Clinton? What happens then? That still remains to be seen.
That's a great question. Let's bring in, of course, Rachel Maddow and Pat Buchanan, part of our panel here as we continue our coverage here on MSNBC, the place for politics, as we remind people. And Rachel, it was interesting. You and I had been all morning sort of sitting together and wondering about the reaction from the Clinton campaign to what might be this new deal on Florida, which would split that, and whether the Clinton campaign would accept that deal or whether they want, as their person said at this committee, I want it all. She said, I want all the delegates, but it looks like they're going to get about half representation. But it appears that Howard Wolfson suggests that might be good enough.
It might be good enough. It remains to be seen. There was a very dramatic moment this morning between Robert Wexler and Harold Ickes. Harold Ickes, a member of the committee, Robert Wexler speaking for the Obama campaign. And at one point, Ickes put a very pointed question to Wexler and said, are you committed to the issue of fair reflection? And Wexler bellowed back at him, you're going to have to educate me on that. And Ickes very quietly said, no, and then got up and walked away from his microphone. Well, Ickes did come back to his microphone later, and during the discussion of the Michigan delegates, he brought up this issue of fair reflection. Fair reflection is one of those terms of art in Democratic Party rules and the rules about how they do these things that says that the delegates ought to reflect the will of the voters. At least that's as well as I understand it. That may be the leg the Clinton campaign tries to stand on when they make their case that this issue should stay unresolved, that they do not feel that justice has been done, even if the Florida and Michigan delegations agree with the compromise along with Senator Obama's campaign.
And we're all learning a great deal about the Democratic process and the Democratic Party rules. Fair reflection, of course, one of the key words today, as you point out, because when it comes to Michigan, where 40% voted uncommitted, how do you fairly reflect the views of the voters? And I think that's part of what is, as Senator Carl Levin said, look, this is imperfect, but we've got 128 delegates in Michigan that we've got to proportion. And he said the way we've come up with it, as well as the head of the Michigan State Party, essentially is a 69-59 split. And that was based on some exit polling, based on the turnout of the polls. A lot of members of this Rules and Bylaws Committee sort of skeptical about using exit polls to sort of make that apportionment. Is quite fascinating. And also when Ickes, again, questioned Senator Carl Levin said, you're calling for fair representation of a flawed primary. Yeah. They acknowledged this was a flawed primary in Michigan, even though Senator Carl Levin retains the right, he says, to move up the Michigan primary, which is what they wanted to do before the Super Tuesday states, because they don't believe that Iowa and New Hampshire should have the say in the primary voting process.
That's right.
How will this be viewed at the end of the day, Rachel? Will this be viewed as a party that is still divided? Or will this be viewed as a party that spent a day in public hashing it out and coming out unified?
This is exactly the right question to be asking. And I think the thing that people are worried about is whether this is going to be viewed as the Democratic Party sort of navel-gazing itself to death. There is something that is missing from the Michigan discussion. I'm hearing two different agendas articulated. On the one hand, you are hearing Carl Levin's very impassioned advocacy for Michigan having the same sort of privilege in the primary process that Iowa and New Hampshire have long enjoyed. This has been a crusade of his for a very long time, as well as other people in Michigan. Michigan. So he wants to press this case to have Michigan seated in full because of that issue of how Michigan votes in general and whether or not they can go earlier. On the other hand, you are hearing from people who support Clinton's take on this that they really want to litigate the allocation of delegates within the full delegation being seated, how those things get apportioned and whether or not the uncommitted delegates get counted. You know what you're missing in all of this? You're missing in all of this an argument against both of those positions that says, whatever we do, this has to end today. Nobody is making the argument. There's this assumption it's bad if we go to the convention. Nobody's overtly arguing this has to not go to the Credentials Committee. It has to not go to the convention. Democrats will lose if that happens. That's missing so far from these arguments. The Obama campaign could be doing that. They've chosen not to, presumably for strategic reasons. But at some point, that is the elephant in the room here.
Yeah, I wonder whether, Rachel, it's going to be like in the 60s, no justice, no peace. If they don't get what they see as justice, they may not resolve this issue and go all the way, as Nora says, to at least the credentials next month or in July, or perhaps to Denver in August.
You can see that coming if you look at the overall strategy instead of the case that they're making literally. If the overall strategy is that this remain unresolved, then sure, you yell no justice, no peace. You call this a civil rights matter. You say that this is a matter of fundamental American justice and our constitutional inheritance as Americans, and you raise the rhetoric and you raise the level of heat enough to justify the extreme political act you are taking, which is to bring this all the way to the convention.
Well, I should say to be
Rachel.
I think that the things we need to watch for is whether or not there is a push to resolve or whether there isn't a push to resolve. And it's true that Nancy Pelosi has been saying this can't go to the convention, this must be resolved, this must be over. She's the lone voice saying that, really. It's not been coming from the Obama campaign. We can imagine a scenario, I think, after Puerto Rico, where Hillary Clinton says what happened yesterday in Washington did not fully resolve Florida and Michigan. Justice has not been done in those cases. I will take up that issue for the people of Florida and Michigan to make sure all those votes are counted. I am competing in the popular vote. At some point, the Obama campaign is going to have to decide, do you start smacking down the Clinton campaign over the popular vote argument? You know, the popular vote argument, what do you count for Nevada and Maine and Washington and Iowa, who didn't even report what their popular vote totals were? I mean, did they just not count? Does the one person, one vote banner of justice not fly over those states too? At some point, you have to actually take on the arguments that are pushing this to an unresolved primary on Tuesday. You can't just assume that they're going to resolve themselves, because the Clinton campaign is clearly signaling that they are in it to stay in it, no matter what.
Rachel, your thought, and then I'm sorry, Nora.
I think my thought on this is that the Clinton campaign is operating at two levels. The Clinton campaign is making arguments that on surface make sense and are internally cogent. And then the Clinton campaign is also operating at a strategic level that doesn't always coincide with what they're saying. So you get Howard Wolfson making this case and saying, we are all about unifying the party. We are utterly committed to unifying the party. And by the way, remember that creepy pastor?
Yeah.
And then making that, and it just tells you everything that you need to know about the distance between their rhetoric and their strategy.
I got the feeling we're going to come out. Nora, why don't you take over and lead the panel for a while? It seems to me that what's going on here is possibly a double victory, a split double header like in baseball, where Hillary Clinton does come out ahead in being able to say, hey, look, I got a popular vote big pickup in Florida. I can claim the one in Michigan, depending on what happens in the Credentials Committee a month or so from now. And meanwhile, Barack Obama can say, I'm still holding my big lead in elected delegates.
Well, that's the perfect scenario for the Democratic Party and for the chairman of the Democratic Party, Howard Dean, who wants to, and said this morning in his speech, that the challenge is to come together at the end of the day and be united. And clearly both campaigns want to walk away from a meeting at the Democratic National Committee being able to say, I got a victory out of this. I think that's perhaps a little over-optimistic. I mean, even someone at the DNC told me that they wanted some sort of photo op, if they could arrange it at the end of the day, of everybody sort of, holding hands together, this united party.
Here's who would be in that photo. It would be Howard Dean, Barack Obama, Senator Clinton, and an asterisk. If they really are going to punt on Michigan, then that asterisk is still out there. Not only does that mean there's an unresolved dispute, but it means there's no magic number. It means we do not know what the final number is of the delegate number that a candidate needs to clinch the nomination. It means the question is still open. If Michigan is unresolved today, if that's still going to go on to the next level, then that asterisk is there. The campaign is not closed down until Obama shuts it down with a lot of superdelegates, which he hasn't been able to do so far.